Our next speaker is Elaine Riehm. Riehm is the author of Turbulent Times in Mathematics, The Life of J.C. Fields, and the History of the Fields Medal with Francis Hoffman. The notable biography was co-published by the Fields Institute and the American Mathematical Society in 2011. When her husband, Carl Riehm, was a graduate student at Princeton, someone asked Elaine and Carl what they knew about John Charles Fields. At that time, their answer was nothing at all. When decades later, Carl joined the mathematics department at McMaster, they found themselves living near Hamilton, where Fields was born. Thus began Elaine's journey to find Fields in the archives of the Hamilton Wentworth Board of Education, University of Toronto Archives, and eventually the Mittag Leffler Institute in Sweden, and outwards in archives and records around the world. Eventually teaming up with genealogist Francis Hoffman, whose husband Peter was a mathematician at Waterloo, the two began a productive collaboration, uncovering documents and records, such as the passenger lists of many 20th century steamships, where they were able to locate Fields, as well as in libraries in Europe and North America. Today, Riehm shares some of what she discovered about Fields' organization of the 1924 International Congress of Mathematicians in Toronto. Welcome, and thank you.
Thank you very much. Hello, everybody, friends and colleagues, and everybody who's here. Yes, and I would like to introduce Francis Hoffman, my co-author. Francis, would you please stand? Francis Hoffman, yes. Now, Francis was dogged in the pursuit of Fields. Fields was dogged in the... Pardon?
The mic.
Oh, yes, thank you. Can you hear me at the back? I'm sorry?
You just need to put this in your
I just need what?
We'll put this in your pocket.
Okay. All right, I'll start again. Francis Hoffman, can you hear me? That's much better. Can you hear me at the back? Good, thank you. All right, well, I would like to introduce Francis because Francis was dogged in the pursuit of Fields. Fields was dogged in the pursuit of money for research for mathematics. But Francis discovered that the steamship lines of the earliest 20th century kept passenger lists, and she was able to track Fields as he crisscrossed the Atlantic and the Pacific. He was a traveler by instinct, and he had a small amount of money inherited from his parents, which allowed him to indulge in travel. I'm going to overlap a little bit with Marcus Barnes in the early life of Fields, but I will not overlap with him in mathematics. In the 19th century, mathematicians modestly held that mathematics was the queen of the sciences. Unlike physics, chemistry, biology, geology, mathematics did not require either laboratories or complicated equipment. The tools were few: pencil, paper, chalk, blackboards, and increasingly the contact with other mathematicians. In 1897, the city of Zurich and the Federal Republic, the Federal Polytechnic, welcomed over 200 mathematicians to Zurich for the first International Mathematical Congress, as it was known, the International Congress of Mathematicians. There were stirring speeches of welcome and proposals for future action. One of the people in attendance was Emile Picard, and he, at the end of the conference, proposed a toast. I drink to, can everybody see that? I don't need to read it then. He proposed the following toast that you will see there, and saluting the different tendencies in the mathematical spirit. And that has always struck me as being a very important comment about mathematics. Following the successful meeting in Zurich, in 1897. There were congresses held in Paris, 1900, Heidelberg, 1904, Rome, 1908, and Cambridge, England, 1912. The sequence stopped, of course, with the First World War, which interrupted all international collaboration in sciences and probably in every field of studies. It was expected that the war would be short and that the interruption in international relations would also be short, but neither was true. The 1924 ICM in Toronto was the first Congress to be held outside of Europe. And how it came to Toronto is a story about the schism in mathematics as the result of World War I. And it's also a story of the personal, it's part of the personal story of John Charles Fields. He was born, as Marcus has told us, in 1863 before Confederation. His mother, Harriet Bowes Fields, was a teacher. His father ran a leather findings shop in downtown Hamilton. And I imagine Fields as a young boy worked in that shop. He was good with math, and he probably could make change. In any event, the city of Hamilton had reorganized its schools in the 1850s and had built a very large modern school. Next slide, please. Central Public School in Hamilton. Those of you who know Hamilton at all will realize that that building still exists, and it still is a public school, much renovated inside. That's an 1863 engraving of the school. They were good schools. There were specialized teachers and 1,000 students in that school. So the city of Hamilton was considered to be advanced in public education at the time when Fields attended those very good schools. His father and mother died when he was in high school, leaving him with a small estate that enabled him to indulge in travel and also to continue his education. Following his graduation from 1884 from U of T, he attended Johns Hopkins University, as we have heard. He then taught briefly at Allegheny College. I don't think it was a happy 3 years he spent there. And he soon was induced to go to graduate school, first at the Sorbonne and then at the University of Berlin. He spent 2 years, by my records, in Paris, followed by 5 or 6 years in Berlin. At Johns Hopkins, he encountered research. The university was set up for research, and Fields, in some sense, discovered research at Johns Hopkins. And for the rest of his life, research was his North Star, regardless of his own research. Once he settled in Toronto, Fields made friends with like-minded colleagues who were also interested in promoting research. Among these are J.C. McLennan in physics, W. Lash Miller in chemistry, Clarence Augustus Chant in astronomy, and W.A. Parks in geology. Those of you from Toronto may recognize some of those names. They were Fields' colleagues. They all went as parts of delegations to the Ontario government to try to raise money for a graduate school and also for research in general. The Premier of Ontario, George William Ross at the time, replied, he was not in favor of making our university a postgraduate school, period. Fields, however, was, and he was dogged and persistent. He was also active during these years in the Royal Canadian Institute, which Marcus has mentioned, and he hoped he would develop the Institute into an organization that sponsored and funded research, not just disseminated the knowledge of research. And he canvassed far and wide for money. He lobbied the Ontario government, he lobbied friends, he lobbied people at the York Club to which he belonged, influential people, but it was never enough money. In 1914, he boarded the SS Orvieto. Next slide. Oh, there's Sergeant Field. That's the earliest photograph we have of Fields. It was taken in Toronto, but we discovered that photograph in the archives at the Mittag-Leffler Institute. Fields had sent it to Mittag-Leffler. That was very common in those days. Okay, in early July 1914, next slide, please. Oh, yes. Okay. The first meeting that Fields attended of any significance was the Abel Centenary held in Norway. And this was an eye-opener for Fields. Because he knew both German and French, he was able to move easily among European colleagues and did so. Then in July 1914, he boarded the SS Orvieto. Next slide, please. Oh, there's Mittag-Leffler, who became a friend of Fields and befriended and helped him get his book published. Next slide. Next one. Okay. So in July of 1914, Fields boarded the SS Orvieto in the south of France in Toulon on his way to a mathematics meeting, the British Association for the Advancement of Science, meetings that were being held in Australia. And it so happened that one night on board, he sat next to a Scottish mathematician named J.E.A. Stegel, who recorded sourly in his diary, "Professor Fields sat by me and harangued about the endowment of research. He seems to think that governments should make no limit to their expenditures in the direction of research." And that summed up Fields pretty well. 2 weeks earlier, on the 28th of June in 1914, a Serbian nationalist had assassinated the heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, Archduke Ferdinand, and his wife Sophia. In the month that followed, international relations unraveled, international diplomacy failed. Little information about these events reached passengers on the SS Orvieto until a Marconigram arrived announcing that war was general. When the ship landed in Adelaide, Australia on 8th August, war fever was high and Union Jacks flew everywhere. There were 3 German scientists on board the SS Orvieto, and one can only imagine their discomfort and everyone's discomfort at their presence. Australia went ahead and awarded honorary degrees to these scientists and released the German scientists who were beyond war age to get home in any way they could, but put in prison the younger scientists who were of war age. I came across a very touching letter in the archives of the German Mathematical Society. It was from a mother of a young German who was in jail in Australia. And she requested the German Mathematical Society to do what it could do to secure the release of her son from an Australian jail. Of course, we can see now he was much safer in jail in Australia than he would have been in the trenches of Europe. So anyway, the international optimism, which we encountered in Zurich in 1897, evaporated as scientists, writers, philosophers, theologians, and ordinary people lined up behind their own countries. Émile Picard, I think there should be a slide. There's Émile Picard. Émile Picard said, "Quoique savants, nous restons hommes." Although scholars, we are still men. Next slide. And Felix Klein wrote, "Everyone will be held to his own country in light and dark days." So the international spirit was going. Robert Faulkner, the president of the University of Toronto at the time, published a book called The German Tragedy and Its Meaning for Canada, in which he wrote, "Germany, once the home of Leibniz, Lessing, Goethe, and Kant, has become an outlaw, waging her campaign of frightfulness like one demented." So you can see that the war of words was very strong at that particular time. And the World War put an end to all scientific cooperation. At a meeting in London in 1918, just a month before the war was over, a conference met in London, and they were looking at what would happen post-war to scientific relations. And they determined that there would be no further scientific relations between scientists of the Allies and scientists of the Central Powers, Germany's allies. So that put a sort of official end to scientific relations across this divide between the two warring groups. There were dissenters from that policy, and I should mention their names. Hardy from Britain, Gustav Mittag-Leffler from Sweden, Jacobus Captain from the Netherlands, and Darcy Thompson from Scotland, all appealed to the International Research Council, but their appeals were denied. So the relations were ended. In 1920, there was another mathematical congress held in Strasbourg, France. This was a very bad place to hold a conference because Strasbourg had been part of France until 1870, then taken by the Germans in the Franco-Prussian War, and restored to France by the Treaty of Versailles in 1919. So it was definitely not the right place for harmonious international relations. And Mittag-Leffler didn't attend, neither did Fields. But there was, at that meeting, a contingent of Americans. And they thought it would be much better to have in the next Congress in 1924 held outside of Europe, because the atmosphere in Europe was so bitterly divided by the war. I'm getting it in. The person who proposed the conference move was L.E. Dixon. Is that name familiar to mathematicians? He was an American mathematician. Next slide, please. Well, there's Robert Faulkner, president of the UT at the time. And there were soldiers training, or students, a student militia in the background. You can see the behind Faulkner. Next slide, please. L.E. Dixon from the University of Chicago proposed that the next conference, the next Congress, 1924, be held in the States. And that was a welcome proposal, welcomed by everybody. And so it was planned that the 1924 Congress would be held in the vicinity of New York. There were problems, however. The problems were the Americans could not agree among themselves about whether scientists from Germany and its allies should be invited or not. And it caused a lot of trouble to them. The question, should Germans be invited? If it's an international mathematical congress, of course they should be. On the other hand, the French would not come if the Germans did. So Fields was present, and he thought somehow if that Congress were moved to Toronto, he could swing it. Those were his words. He said, "I believe I could swing the conference." And he did. First, he had to raise money, of course, and he traveled across Canada with great energy, visiting the new universities of the West, as well as the more established ones in the center and in the East. And he personally visited Prime Minister Mackenzie King. Next slide, please. There should be one of Mackenzie King there.
Something on the monitor here.
Oh.
It sent us to the wrong, just-
There, okay. There's Prime Minister Mackenzie King. He was a graduate of the University of Toronto and probably slightly biased in favor of Toronto for that reason. In any event, he secured a federal grant of $20,000 for the Congress and $10,000 for the proceedings. This was a very generous government grant. But as matters turned out, it was not enough money. Fields, however, wanted to drum up attendance for his meeting, and he went to Europe to visit various mathematical societies. He sent telegrams, wrote to people urging them to attend and letting them know that there would be a subsidy available for travel for delegates. Next slide, please. This was the invitation that people received. And at that time, conversazione was a common word for conferences. And this was the invitation to the International Mathematical Congress of 1924. The Congress was held at the Convocation Hall. There's Convocation Hall in a charming engraving by someone named Owen Staples, who did a lot of artwork in Toronto. The Congress ended on the 16th of August, 1924. Fields' work, however, was not done. First, he accompanied delegates on a cross-Canada train trip, and on his return, he began his work on the proceedings that you see before you there. At that time, it was typesetting mathematics was not possible really in Canada, but Fields worked closely with the University of Toronto Press, and they actually developed fonts and symbols that could be used and were used for the proceedings. Next slide. There is Fields in 1924, the 16th, the final day of the conference, when the large group photograph was taken that you see outside. This is a detail of it, and there's Fields looking kind of exhausted, but intact. But by then, Fields was in poor health. He turned his attention and energy to the possibility of establishing an international medal to honor research in mathematics of every sort. He said it should encourage further mathematics, which is how it has come to be interpreted as a medal to be given to someone maximum age of 40. That was not Fields' idea. At his death in 1932, he left in his will the money to support the medal, at least for a period of time. And the medal, although he stipulated it should be international and have no modern language and no living person on it, the medal does feature Archimedes. I think the next slide, please. There's the medal, which we see over there. The sculptor, R. Tate Mackenzie, was a Canadian, also born in Almont, Ontario, and had a career at University of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia. So Fields made use of all the money that he had been given by Mackenzie King, but it was never enough money. I don't want to leave the idea that Fields was responsible alone for the 1924 Congress. He was not. He had friends and colleagues who were faithful and attended countless meetings. And I would like just to show you a brief picture of them. This is McLennan, a physicist at University of Toronto and a close friend of Fields. Next. Parkes. Parkes wrote the guidebook for visitors who took the long train trip west. He's a geologist, and his guidebook was filled with geological information. He's also the paleontologist who founded the dinosaur collection at the museum. And here he is on a dig in Alberta. Next slide. This is Jacques Chapelon. He was a particular friend of Fields. He was from France, and he was very instrumental in handling the translations of French talks for the proceedings. The only picture I could find of him is as a young student a young student cadet in France around 1905. There must be other pictures of him, and if you ever come across one, I would like to know it. Now, next slide, please. Clarence and Augustus Chant in astronomy attended every meeting that Fields held faithfully, but I couldn't find a slide of them. Next one. Ferdinand Mouret. He was the university organist and the bursar and the treasurer of the 1924 ICM. And he put an enormous amount of time and effort into the Congress and its organization. Next slide. And this is Singh. Singh was Fields' personal executor, and he also carried through Fields' plans to establish the medal. In other words, he had it accepted by the 1932 Congress in Oslo, I think it was. And that is Singh. He was a longtime professor at University of Toronto, and then I think he went to one of the Carolinas. Somebody here knows? Anyway, he finished his career in the States, but he was selfless in helping Fields. And as I said, he was his personal executor as well. So those are the people who helped Fields. And I should mention, in addition, there were many students. And what did they do? Well, in the absence of telephones in the dormitories and residence where the delegates were staying, they ran errands, carried messages, escorted delegates, and added a youthful air to all of the events of the 1924 ICM. Thank you.